Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us during Mental Health Week for our second annual live webinar here at the Queensland Brain Institute. This year we're going to be discussing the topic of brain health for mental health. I'm Dr. James Kesby. I'm a researcher here at the Queensland Brain Institute. My work focuses on decision making in those with severe mental illness, but we're not here to talk to me. I will be your MC for tonight's webinar. To start off, I'd like to make an acknowledgement of country. The University of Queensland acknowledges the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet. We pay our respects to their ancestors and descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Queensland Brain Institute, this is where we're having our webinar today. We're in our 18th year. We have over 400 staff, all working to unlock the mysteries of the brain. And mental health, which we're talking about today, is one of our core areas of research, with groups delving into genetics, developmental events, and neurochemical changes that all contribute to mental illness and mental well-being. I know that I'm looking forward to exploring these topics in more detail with the great speakers we have here today. So, how important is brain health for mental health? Today we're going to be exploring how sleep, diet, exercise, and circadian rhythm can affect your brain health. We have 4 experts with us today that span from fundamental research all the way through to treating people suffering from mental health problems. In order of our speakers today, we have Dr. Suetani, Dr. Alena Pribyl, Associate Professor Shuichi Suetani, and Professor Bruno van Swinderen. So thanks for joining us this afternoon. Thanks to all our speakers for coming on today. So our format today will be a short presentation from each speaker. And as a fee for me emceeing the show today, QBI has generously allowed me to ask each speaker one question. I'm pretty cheap, it seems. But don't worry, afterwards, those questions you've submitted online during the presentations will be put on the screen and we can ask them to our presenters. And please keep sending them through. If we don't get to them today, if time doesn't allow, we might be able to send you those answers via email afterwards. We will try to get through as many as we can. So first up, we have Dr. Suetani. Dr. Tai leads the Functional Neuromodulation and Novel Therapeutics Laboratory here at Queensland Brain Institute and is looking at how stress affects brain health and mental health and how disruption of stress hormones during our circadian rhythm can affect recovery from depression. Thank you for being here today, Sue.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today and have the opportunity to talk about some of the work that we do. Our research looks at some of the effects of stress on the brain during or that lead to depression. And we're very interested in understanding how antidepressant treatments work. And part of the way that we study that is actually by disrupting the circadian rhythm. And it's one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about this today because it's something that affects all of us every day. Our bodies function along a circadian rhythm, which means our physiology changes over the course of the 24-hour period. And stress hormones such as cortisol peak just before rising, and they're illustrated here on the slide with the green line. Just before the light period, the cortisol will be released from the adrenal glands and circulate through the body, and that has a really important physiological function to help us become alert, active. It helps synchronise metabolic changes throughout the body, activates a number of systems that help us to get up and get going throughout the day. People may find that they are able to focus more effectively during this time, and all of that is, cortisol is playing a role in all of these processes. And then over the course of the day, by about midday, we see a decline in that level of cortisol. And towards the end of the day, it's at its lowest point, and light serves to signal the switch from that cortisol system to melatonin being released. Then melatonin is released in the evening phase, and that increases over the course of that period to help the body switch off and to go to sleep and to rest and repair. And these are in very close balance, and with our studies, we simply disrupt that circadian rhythm. So we give a boost of cortisol during that night period when it should be at its low point. And we see that alone doesn't necessarily lead to depression, but what it does is causes a whole range of metabolic changes in the animals that we study, and we see similar changes in patients with depression that are treatment resistant, where the metabolic changes are occurring at the cellular level. Cortisol plays a critical role in the body of regulating glucose metabolism. It actually signals the release of glucose into the bloodstream, and that helps to provide enough energy. And we think that some of these changes that are occurring with the release of glucose and the effects of cortisol in the cell itself work directly on the mitochondria, which are little organelles in the cell that serve to make energy for the cells to use, and that essentially fuels the cells to do their work. In the brain, we know that this energy plays a critical role in neuroplasticity, in facilitating neurotransmission, the production of proteins, and just the critical processes that are involved in day-to-day healthy brain function. And simply disrupting this circadian rhythm for a period of even just 2 weeks is enough to change the way our brains respond to antidepressants. And we see that this metabolic shift that is happening is causing changes in the way that antidepressants can work on the brain to facilitate plasticity and repair and recovery from depression. And it's one of the reasons that we believe that this is really important to talk about here today, because such a simple shift can have such profound effects, and this is something that is very easy to disrupt through artificial sources of light, changes in just staying up too late and working through the night, or sleeping in too late even in the morning. Just shifting that rhythm substantially can change a number of these critical cellular factors. And on this final slide, we just see how stress actually is working, or these stress hormones work to coordinate these messages throughout the body. So as I said, they're critical across the daily circadian rhythm. They're doing a very important role over the course of that time. But with stress, it's facilitating the body's ability to respond to stress. So there's a peak and a surge in cortisol during that time, peak and a surge in glucose and insulin, and a number of other factors in the body that shift the way that the body is functioning to help it cope more effectively with the particular stress that it's facing. And ultimately that can lead to long-term changes in the central nervous system that can impact the ability of these little mitochondria in the cells to make energy in the form of ATP, which the cells then use to keep our brain healthy and strong. And for this reason, we sort of wanted to bring it into the conversation today to make sure that some of the things that we take for granted can be discussed, and we can look at a little bit more closer detail. Thank you.
Excellent talk. Thank you very much. I suppose one of the perfect examples of when our rhythms get disrupted is when we travel and we get jet lag. Everyone, I'm sure, is always asking for strategies as to how maybe we can reset that as fast as possible or acclimate it a bit quicker. And I suppose those strategies would work in a normal situation as well. But are there any things we can do to try and reset that circadian rhythm and those hormonal changes we see?
Absolutely. There are a number of strategies that people do use to help cope with jet lag, and some of them are trying to reset that circadian rhythm by taking melatonin to switch on that melatonin surge to help with that sleep cycle, and then that helps to downregulate the cortisol. It's also just recommended that people wake up with the daylight, and so really keeping that sleep-wake cycle as close as possible to the daylight rhythm can be very helpful. It is also making sure that you keep a regular routine around eating. That also helps to regulate the circadian rhythm. And then being active, going outside in the daylight is also very important when you're maybe in another time zone. And it's important to also, I think, mention that some of these changes in circadian rhythm are enough to trigger a depressive episode or a manic episode or some sort of change in vulnerable individuals. It's not uncommon, and we do think that it is because of this, the vulnerability of this system to those effects of the stress and dysregulation of the circadian rhythm, and the way that the brain is trying to adapt to that may increase that vulnerability. So it's really very important to regulate that as quickly as possible.
And I suppose it would help knowing if it's going to be disrupted ahead of time to prepare as well.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Very interesting. So next up we have Dr. Alena Pribyl. Dr. Pribyl is a senior scientist at Microba Life Sciences, a microbial genomics company based here in Brisbane that specialises in analysing the gut microbiome, so all those little bugs and stuff that live in our stomach. In our intestines, I presume. After moving into Australia in 2015, Alena began working at the Australian Centre for Ecogenomics, which is called ACE here at the University of Queensland, and became involved in research on the human gut microbiome. And this work led her to become a founding team member of Microba. Thank you for coming here to speak with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. I always love talking about the gut microbiome and our health, and so very happy to be here. So today I'm going to talk about how the brain and the gut microbiome and diet are all intertwined. But I thought I'd start real quick just to make sure we're all on the same page discussing what is a gut microbiome. So real quick, the gut microbiome is that community of microorganisms that lives in your gastrointestinal tract. Now, we actually have microorganisms inhabiting our entire body. A fun fact, we have more microorganisms, more cells that are from microorganisms in our body than we have human cells in our body. And what we found is that the majority of those microorganisms are actually inhabiting our gastrointestinal tract, and they become more dense as you traverse that tract. So by the time you hit your colon, that's actually where you're finding the most dense population of microbes. And so when we talk about the gut microbiome, even though technically your gut extends from your mouth to your anus, we're really just talking about the colon, because usually people are measuring the gut microbiome with a stool sample. And the other thing I want to start with as well is probably everybody's heard about how the gut microbiome is linked to disease. I think almost any disease that you can name now has been linked to the gut microbiome. And one of the reasons for this is because our microorganisms in our gut are producing thousands of different metabolic byproducts that we call metabolites. And these metabolites are actually interacting with our human cells. And so we know they're interacting with our human cells and actually influencing multiple systems throughout our body, including our immune system, our metabolic system, and of course our nervous system. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you about today is some of the information that we've learned about how the gut microbiome and its metabolites are actually interacting with our nervous system and our brain. So we currently know, and one thing that we've known actually for quite a while, is that there's bidirectional communication between our gut and our brain. So we know that the gut and the brain communicate together systemically through the production of a lot of different molecules, including hormones, neurotransmitters, and immune molecules that are called cytokines. And these cytokines can either promote inflammation or inhibit inflammation. And we also know that the gut and the brain communicate with each other via the nervous system. So there's a really long nerve that extends all the way from your brain down to your gut called the vagus nerve, and this is kind of a superhighway for communication between the gut and the brain. And then there's also the enteric nervous system, which innervates your entire gut. And so there's multiple mechanisms how the gut and the brain are getting signals back and forth to each other. But what we didn't know until just recently is that another factor playing into that bidirectional communication is those metabolites that are being produced by all those bacteria sitting in our gut. And so over the last 10 years, this has been a very hot area of research. We've had an explosion of research papers in this area, and what we've seen are really kind of three mechanisms that have come out on how the gut microbiome can be influencing our brain. So the first mechanism, and you can see on the diagram there's like a little one there, and you see it's right next to a green cell. Now that green cell is an immune cell called a dendritic cell, and what can happen is either the bacteria themselves or metabolites produced by bacteria can directly interact with receptors on those immune cells. And they can activate those receptors and cause those immune cells to produce those molecules called cytokines that can either promote inflammation or inhibit inflammation. And we know that when microbes are producing these beneficial metabolites called short-chain fatty acids, typically they're inhibiting inflammation. But on the other hand, our microbes can also produce metabolites that can promote inflammation. And in particular, one that's been quite well studied is called lipopolysaccharide. And we know that can actually activate what's called a toll-like receptor 4 on immune cells and trigger an inflammatory cascade. So that's one mechanism, how our microbes might be influencing the brain, because when it's stimulating those immune cells in the gut, those immune cells now are producing those cytokines, which can now traverse into the systemic circulation and can actually travel up to the brainstem. And the cytokines are actually able to traverse the blood-brain barrier, and some people are hypothesizing this might be one mechanism how neuroinflammatory diseases begin, is through these cytokines actually crossing the blood-brain barrier. And one source of those could be the microbes in your gut. Now, the second way that our microbes might be influencing our gut is by stimulating cells in our gut that are called enteroendocrine cells. So if you look on that diagram, there's a blue cell there. That's an enteroendocrine cell, and that cell is actually producing hormones and neurotransmitters. And so that's a cell that can produce serotonin, and it can produce appetite-suppressing hormones. And so research has shown that the microbial compounds called short-chain fatty acids, and in particular one that's called butyrate, can actually stimulate those cells to produce serotonin, peptide YY, and glucagon-like peptide 1, the latter two of which are appetite-suppressing hormones. And so those are sending signals to our brain to tell us, okay, we're full, we can stop eating now. So this is another way that the microbes can be influencing our communication with our gut. It's through appetite-suppressing hormone production and through the serotonin. And in case people weren't aware, about 90% of the serotonin in our body is actually produced in our gut. And so this can actually have quite a large influence. And mouse models have shown that when you don't have a gut microbiome, that these mice are actually producing far less serotonin than if they do have a gut microbiome. So it is playing a key role in that serotonin production. And then finally, the third mechanism through the brain interacting with the gut microbiome is actually through direct contact. So some microbial metabolites can actually be absorbed across that intestinal cell layer and enter into our blood circulation and thus directly reach the brainstem. And so some of these microbial metabolites, again, are beneficial, and again, it's going to come up over and over again, are the short-chain fatty acids. And so this is what's really key, what we're really, a lot of research has gone into to show that these short-chain fatty acids are really beneficial for our health. They're helping inhibit inflammation, so they're anti-inflammatory. They're helping us regulate our appetite. And they are also actually helping to strengthen our blood-brain barrier. So in vitro studies and mouse studies have shown that when you inject mice or when you put cells in contact with some of these short-chain fatty acids, especially butyrate, again, you're actually able to strengthen that blood-brain barrier. Whereas if you inject mice with a pro-inflammatory microbial metabolite like lipopolysaccharide, that can actually weaken the blood-brain barrier. So again, it's very important what your microbes are producing. The final mechanism is just a theoretical one. There has been a couple studies where they've actually looked at cadavers of patients that have had Alzheimer's disease and have found actual pathogens in the brain in the center of the plaques. But that still needs more investigation. So what can you do to make sure that your microbial metabolites are actually, your microbes are actually producing beneficial metabolites? And this is where the diet comes in. So diet matters. What you eat is going to influence which microbial metabolites your gut microbiome is producing. So what we know is probably what we've always known growing up, what we've been taught. If you have a diet full of diverse fibers, that's going to increase the production of those beneficial short-chain fatty acids. Your gut microbes, your beneficial ones, their favorite food is fiber. And so the more different types of fiber you eat, the more short-chain fatty acids they're going to be producing. And that's going to help you have a healthy gut and a happy brain. However, if your diet is lacking in fiber, that means your gut microbes have to look for alternate fuel sources. And that can be the mucus that's lining your intestinal cell barrier, or excess protein. And when your gut microbes are using these as energy sources, that means they're going to be producing a mixed bag of metabolites, many of which can be pro-inflammatory, and that can be triggering gut inflammation and potentially can be contributing to neuroinflammation. Again, there's still a lot of research that needs to be done in this area, but what we are seeing is that the best thing you can do right now to ensure a healthy gut and a healthy brain is to really eat diverse sources of fiber to make sure you're producing those beneficial short-chain fatty acids. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I suppose this is quite a hot topic at the moment. I'm sure lots of people in the audience and scientists in particular have heard a lot about it. And you mentioned that a lot of different mental illnesses have been now associated with altered gut microbiome. So I suppose what currently would you say have the strongest links to altered gut microbiome of the sort of broad range of mental illnesses people face?
No, it's a very good question. I'd say by right now, probably the most research has gone into major depressive disorder. And so we have seen many studies coming out. Most of them are still in animal models, but it's still providing very compelling data. And again, following on with the theme of my talk, what they've seen in these animal models is that you can help alleviate in models of anxiety and depression by treating these mice with prebiotic fibers and short-chain fatty acids. They actually have lower levels of depression and stress. And also, they've seen in humans, there's just one small human study that I found, so there's not a lot out there, but in patients that had type 2 diabetes that were taking a validated test for depression, they also found by treating type 2 diabetes patients with prebiotic fibers, they were able to reduce scores on the validated depression questionnaire.
Oh, great.
Again,
great.
there's still a lot more research that needs to be done, but that's very compelling what's coming out.
That's good to know. Thank you very much. So our third speaker today, I'm delighted to introduce Associate Professor Shuichi Suetani. I've had the privilege of working with Shuichi for quite a few years now, and he's a very avid psychiatrist who works in the community to help people get through some very severe problems. He's been researching, he's focused on relationship between physical activity, exercise, and mental disorders, and he currently works at the Institute of Indigenous Urban Health. Thanks for coming here today, Shuichi.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you for inviting me. So I'm Shuichi, I'm a psychiatrist, and I feel quite intimidated being here with all these scientists, and I've got no pretty slides on my PowerPoints, but James asked me to talk about exercise because I did a PhD looking at mental health and exercise a couple of years back. So I'm going to talk about my 4 years of PhD in next 5 minutes. So we actually looked at the relationship between epidemiological relationship between mental disorders and physical activity, and I was supervised by Professor John McGrath, who works here, and Professor James Scott. We looked at 3 large data sets. So we looked at 2 cross-sectional studies, so National Survey of Mental Health and Wellbeing, which had about 8,800 people there. The Survey of High Impact Psychosis, or the SHIP study, which had about 1,600 people with psychotic illness, conducted back in 2010. And the MASP study, Mater University of Queensland study of pregnancy, which is a really exciting study. And I'm guessing that some of you watching this might actually be part of this study. But basically, they recruited about 7,000 babies who were born at Mater Hospital back in 1982, 83, 84. They got the data from the babies, they got the data from mum, and they kind of kept following these people up, and they are still following these cohorts up. And someone just told me that it got to the point where in the most recent follow-up, the babies of Mater MUSP study are having babies. So we've got 3 generations of data. The MUSP babies mums of the must babies and babies' babies. So it's a really exciting study. Lots of papers have come out of it, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more to come out in the future. But for my PhD, I was able to access data from when the babies turned 14, 21, and 30. Now, the good thing about my PhD was my findings were quite consistent. I guess the bad thing was that we never actually found anything. But what we found was that when we looked at the cross-sectional association between physical activity and mental disorders, so what I mean by this is if you've got a whole cohort of people, thousands of people, and we divide these people into two groups. So one group that meets the criteria for some kind of mental disorder, and another group that does not meet the criteria for any kind of mental disorder. And when you compare the two groups in terms of the physical activity engagement, you did not find any difference in the two groups. Now, likewise, when we looked at longitudinal associations, so what I mean by this is you start off with two groups at baseline, so people who meet the diagnostic criteria for some kind of mental disorder, and another group that don't meet the criteria, and you go back and ask the same people about the physical activity status 5, 7, and 10 years later. And what we found was that the baseline mental health status did not predict or did not impact on the subsequent physical activity status in the future. So what we concluded was mental disorder diagnosis itself was not associated with reduced physical activity. Now, here's take-home message from my PhD. I want to emphasize that exercise as an intervention, I'm a big fan of exercise as an intervention for people with mental illness. It is safe, it is cheap, and it's acceptable for many people living with mental disorders. And there have been lots of studies that have shown benefits in terms of both physical and emotional well-being among people with mental illness. But I think we need to be careful in psychiatry about overestimating the benefit, the positive potential for exercise. We've got this habit of over-promising and not reaching potential in psychiatry. And I guess what my PhD findings suggest is as good as exercise might be, it's probably not going to prevent people from developing mental illness. It's probably not going to cure or fix mental disorders. So as good as exercise intervention might be, it's not the silver bullet that we are looking for in terms of mental illness in psychiatry. But, so this is the double negative that makes it positive. But the actual real message I want to send is having a mental disorder diagnosis itself should not be a barrier to engaging in physical activity. So as psychiatrists or as clinicians working with people with mental disorders, we should encourage our patients to engage in exercise interventions. We should help our patients to engage in physical activity. And we should always be looking for different ways in which we can change the environment, the ways we do things for our patients so that people with mental illness, so that it's easier for people with mental illness to engage in physical activity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I suppose we'll probably hear about this later in the discussion, but all these things all impact in different places and different amounts on different disorders. But do you think exercise, given that it's something reliable and easy to get people to do with severe mental disorders, and given that you said that it can improve their well-being, at least emotionally,
Yep.
maybe not from a diagnostic period, should it be part of that package that is that sort of clinical practice that comes in? So we're gonna deal with your diet, your health, your exercise, and we're going to do some cognitive remedial therapy with you as well. And do you think as that part of the package, that's where it will have its most promise?
Yeah, I think so. And I think we are starting to do this. So we are starting to see people like exercise professionals, like exercise physiologists and physiotherapists working within mental health teams. We're starting to ask our patients about how much exercise they do. So I think we are slowly starting to incorporate exercise as part of what we do for people with mental illness.
Oh, that's great. That's great. A personal PT if you see Shuichi here.
Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. Our final speaker today is Professor Bruno van Swinderen. Professor van Swinderen's group used Drosophila, which is a type of fruit fly, as a genetic model system to study mechanisms of perception in the brain. They're interested in 3 phenomena: selective attention, sleep, and general anesthesia. Their focus is on visual perception and how it is affected by these different arousal states. Thanks for talking with us today.
Thanks, James. I always like to talk about sleep. I like that. I also like that picture that you can see up on the left-hand side of the slide. It's from a cover by a book by this great science fiction author Isaac Asimov, Robot Dreams. And it's a robot sleeping. You don't know what kind of sleep they're having, but they look asleep. And I've always felt that when we really will understand sleep is when our computers or our robots have to sleep. Right? At that point, we'll know what sleep is really for. And it's not just rebooting your computer. Clearly, sleep requires more time. It almost needs real time. And you can sort of see that on the graph on the right, which is a typical what's called sleep hypnogram. And this is an average human adult's sleep cycle, not mine, but an average adult sleep cycle. And typically what happens is early in the night, you go quickly into deep sleep, also called slow wave sleep. And then you alternate with 90-minute cycles with what's called REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. And I think a lot of people know that about sleep, that it has these different stages that alternate. It's interesting that the slow wave sleep is kind of bulked up at the beginning of the night, and the REM sleep, which is when we have our most vivid dreams, is kind of more towards the end of the night. And by the end of your sleep cycle in the morning, you're mostly dreaming. And that says something interesting about sleep functions, I think, already, that, for example, if you're sleep deprived, you'll have quicker, deeper, higher amplitude slow wave sleep. But you also need REM sleep, right? If you selectively deprive people of REM sleep, they'll have more REM sleep afterwards. So there's a rebound effect that happens afterwards. Now, what are the functions of sleep? This is becoming increasingly discovered, especially for deep sleep and slow wave sleep. And deep sleep is largely about repair, right? One can think about that as cells in the brain, neurons, needing to be fixed, right? So why would you want to fix your car while driving it? You would want to stop and repair your car and check the oil and make sure all the screws are tight, and you can't do that well if you're driving. And that's what happens with deep sleep, is that there's a lot of repair mechanisms happening. There's synapses being weakened. The rubbish is taken out of the brain, metabolites. Stress regulation is happening. And that's becoming increasingly understood. And that's evident in humans and in flies, right? It's across the animal kingdom. But REM sleep, when we have our most our vivid dreams, is much more mysterious, right? That's why should we be spending hours every night in a virtual reality in a way? And it's a strange question that's inspired actually many religions. Now, a lot of the explanations for REM sleep now seem to be centered on emotional regulation, kind of related to what Dr. Tai was talking about with depression. People with depression often have too much REM. If you take antidepressants, it gets rid of your REM sleep. So there's a very clear connection in a way that's not understood between REM sleep and emotional regulation. And maybe one way of getting a clue of what REM sleep is for is by looking at what's called a sleep ontogeny, which is your sleep architecture through life. And that's the graph that you see there on the right, that colorful graph, where you're seeing different sections of really a child's life, from prenatal to postnatal to a couple months to up to 16 years. Green is their time awake, blue is their time in deep sleep, and yellow is their time in REM sleep. And what's immediately obvious is that there's much more REM sleep in early childhood, especially in a prenatal child, right? So before birth, human brains are heavily engaged in dream sleep, which raises the question, obviously, what are they dreaming about? And what I'll try to argue is that it's not about the dreams, it's about something else. Now, clearly, when you look at this graph, that there's so much REM sleep happening in brain development, in early brain development, it immediately suggests that it has something to do about wiring the brain, and that wiring persists through life and up to adulthood as a kind of rewiring that has to happen on a nightly basis to somehow keep us functionally adaptive. So that's the kind of sleep ontogeny of REM sleep. But how does emotional regulation fit into that, right? Are prenatal infants super emotional? That's why they have so much REM sleep. And I think one way to understand it is to think about what emotions are for. In a way, emotions are for detecting prediction errors, right? They're a way for you to somehow have a model of what's happening next, a prediction of what's going to happen next, what's going to be the consequence of your actions, and seeing if your prediction is actually borne out. And if it's not borne out, you're surprised, and you can be angry or upset or happy, or you think it's funny if it's a joke. And that really starts off with an infant brain making predictions about its own body movements. This is my leg, this is my arm moving, this is something, at the side of my head, I don't know what it is, it's an ear. And then what are really its own body parts and something that is beyond itself, right? Where does its body begin and end? And it's very clear when you look at this graph then that the emotional regulation that's characteristic of REM sleep could be really explained by an evolutionary antecedent, which is just about prediction errors, right? How does a body make predictions about the world? And how does it make predictions about the world outside the womb afterwards to be able to cope with the environment? And that's an interesting explanation for REM sleep, I think, that could be articulated in a different way, that we basically, the brain sort of wires itself to become conscious as an infant, and then keeps on having to rewire to stay conscious, right? And that without REM sleep, we might actually become unconscious and become habit-driven animals that are only behaving reflexively, which is actually an interesting philosophical view about just culturally the importance of REM sleep. Now, Theodosius Dobzhansky, a population geneticist, a Russian population geneticist, said something interesting, that nothing in biology makes sense outside the light of evolution, right? You have to see this in an evolutionary context. REM sleep didn't come from nowhere. It evolved somehow. And one idea that we're working on in the lab that I think is quite compelling is that all animals sleep, and a variety of animals have what's called quiet sleep, which is the repair aspect of sleep, fixing the cells, making sure that everything is clean and simple and working well. And animals like jellyfish, hydra, nematodes have that. And that evolved into what we call slow wave sleep in a small niche of animals, birds and mammals, right, that somehow subsumed these same functions. And that something happened at some point in evolution, coincident with the evolution of brains, where active sleep was required, which is when your brain looks awake, which is what happens during REM, but you're disconnected from the outside world, you're in a virtual reality. And that was required then for animals to pay attention properly and be able to predict the world in an adaptive way. And flies have that, cuttlefish have that, fish have that. Most animals that have a brain seem to have that. And the very compelling kind of idea here then is, does that mean these animals are conscious? If REM sleep is about maintaining our consciousness, what does it say about animal consciousness? And what we can do with animal models then is we can study these specific models like a worm or a jellyfish or a fly to really unpack different sleep functions. Do we want to study repair? Do we want to study prediction, adaptation? And that's how we can use animal models like flies to be able to do this in a very systematic way to help us understand sleep in humans and tailor sleep for fixing human disease.
It's really interesting. I think you probably get a lot of questions about sleep all the time. I know everyone's interested in it. I think just to touch on the last point you made about fixing disease, how do you think sleep can be almost like a therapy for a specific brain problem, and maybe the cause has been a lack of sleep, and how, if that's the case, how would you go about maybe, what strategies would there be, or what evidence is there and ways to improve that?
Great question,
sleep?
James. The problem with that question is using the one word for sleep, as if sleep is just one thing. So I'm going to give sleep to an animal, to somebody to fix something. But if sleep encompasses maybe a dozen different functions, like metabolite clearance and synaptic weakening and prediction regulation, you want to tailor those individually, right? So if you wanted to, for example, fix a stroke patient, you might want to give them a lot of deep sleep, slow wave sleep. And it's known that people who have strokes actually have a lot of deep sleep. And if you wanted to fix depression, maybe deep sleep's not the right thing to provide, and you actually want to look at some kind of a REM sleep mechanism. And by understanding all the different sleep functions, we can target them individually, know their molecular pathways, and maybe even make them work in the absence of sleep. I mean, that would be the ideal situation. Army's been very interested in this.
As with everything, more and more complex as we get closer and closer to answering the questions we start with. Fantastic. So now we're going to open it up for questions and comments from the audience if you've put them through that web link there. So you can click on the speech bubble still, it's below me somewhere on your screen, and provide your name and email address, so in case we don't get to them today, maybe we can email you back some answers afterwards. We've got them coming up on the screen now, but I suppose to start things off, I'm going to steal another question before they throw me off the stage here, and sort of we've each sort of 4 different topics here, I suppose we've had. And when someone has a problem, I can see that, say, sleep might affect the microbiome, or circadian rhythm disruption might affect sleep. Could one problem cause the others, and therefore the others are just a downstream effect? And how do we get around that sort of this global interconnected system to sort of find the cause of the problem in an individual? Very broad, but just to start the discussion and then kick it off. I don't know who wants to start.
Well, I would say sort of from the research that we've been doing across sort of inflammatory systems, stress systems, metabolic systems, where we've sort of come to the conclusion is there's no... We can look at them from different angles, but they're one functional unit. And we've got to look at the whole person as an individual, their whole physiology as part of them, as part of their brain health, and as part of their mental health. And so I think we artificially separate them as scientists. We have to, so that we can study and find out the next sort of microscopic detail that we can, to put another piece in that jigsaw puzzle of understanding the human body and brain and mind. But I think they ultimately do work together, so it's an ebb and flow between them.
I definitely would agree. I mean, I think that's one thing that we've discovered with the gut microbiome is it's potentially contributing to, multiple different systems in the body and multiple different disease states. And so, it's just one piece of that jigsaw puzzle. And hopefully we can eventually put it all together.
I guess, and I agree with you guys, but and it kind of makes sense in my head that if you're depressed, you're not going to sleep very well, and if you're not sleeping very well, you're going to feel tired, you're not going to be eating very well, if you're not eating very well, you're not going to exercise, all that kind of stuff. So it all makes sense in my head. But I think probably the more interesting question for me is, how do you fix that? Like if you just address one thing, is that going to help with everything else? If you have a good sleep, does that mean you're going to have a better diet and exercise more? Or is that not that simple? But these are the questions that I think, very interesting to us. Yeah.
I don't have much more to add, except I remember it was said that almost every cognitive disorder has some kind of microbiome connection, and I would say the same thing for sleep, right? So you do wonder about the overlap, which one is causal.
I suppose individualized medicine and personalized environmental helping as well, maybe. So one of the questions we have here is on the gut microbiome. So is there a way we can either take like a fecal pill or something that helps our serotonin production in particular?
Wouldn't everybody love that silver bullet repair? Exactly. So first, in terms of fecal transplants, I just want to say that it is still a very risky endeavor. We don't know a lot of the gut bacteria that exist in our gut. 70% of the bacteria in our gut are uncultured, which means they haven't been studied. And so until we actually know what is in a fecal transplant and what those bacteria are doing, it's a very risky endeavor, which is why it's only been approved for use in extreme cases like Clostridium difficile infection. However, to promote serotonin in your gut, the easiest solution is really promoting your gut bacteria to produce those short-chain fatty acids. So we actually know all 3 short-chain fatty acids that gut bacteria can produce, acetate, butyrate, and propionate, can stimulate those enteroendocrine cells to produce serotonin. And the easiest way you can do that, everybody has the gut bacteria, is going to have some gut bacteria in them that are going to produce these beneficial short-chain fatty acids. So the easiest solution right now is to just eat a healthy diet. Just focus on eating as many diverse fibers in your diet as you can. So something that's kind of a fun thing to try that I often try to do is try to get like 20 different plants in my diet every day. And it sounds kind of crazy, but when you think about it, if you have like a muesli cereal, and maybe you put on some strawberries and bananas. You already got 3. Maybe you have a soup that has lots of different vegetables, add in a can of chickpeas. You've got lots of different grains and nuts and seeds. And so really just focusing on diversifying the fiber in your diet is probably the best way to promote serotonin production.
Excellent. Okay, more plants.
Yes.
Check. Okay. So one of the questions here, I'm going to paraphrase a little to expand it out, was about SSRIs, which are a treatment for depression. And I know that also with antipsychotic therapy, some of these treatments that are very important for someone to get back on track with a mental problem like depression or psychosis also include weight gain side effects, no matter to some people how much they exercise. So the question was more of a comment on this. Do you guys have anything to say about that in terms of the treatments and the side effects and what's been done to try and alleviate those issues?
I guess, that's kind of what I struggle with every day, I guess. So it kind of comes back to the risk and benefit of the treatment that you're providing. And if the medications that we use are going to help with getting on with life, that's really important. And it's the balance that I try to strike is just enough medication so that you can do other things, so that depression or psychosis are not going to overwhelm your life. And I admit that we don't always get that right, but it's always about trying to strike that balance. And I don't have a kind of nice answer for that. Yeah.
I suppose it's one of those problems with the drugs that work always have side effects, right?
Yeah.
It's something we have to deal with and learn more from.
Yeah.
Okay, well, on a lighter note, we're going to go something that I probably do more than eat plants, coffee. So I know this is going to, probably at least 3 of you can respond to this. One, coffee, it sort of gets you pumped. So it's probably going to affect your circadian rhythm in some way. It's probably going to affect your microbes because it's a stimulant in there, and it's probably going to then affect your sleep. So how much coffee should we have? Is it good for us, and what problems will it cause me later in life? I'm going to direct it to, we'll go to Bruno first. How does coffee affect your sleep?
I never have coffee in the afternoon. It ruins my sleep that night. But that's also maybe my age, right? I could have done that as a teenager, as a young adult, but I found that it's a very strong stimulant to prevent sleep. But then there's also the kind of the fact that I'm a conscious human being, and I think I just had coffee. Oh, maybe I'm not going to sleep. And then that kind of a loop happens in your brain that, is a completely different story. And there's always that confound. So I can't really answer the question about coffee, except that I would go easy on it in the afternoon.
Make sure you get your sleep, don't have coffee too late. Yeah. So what about circadian rhythm? Does having that early pump in the morning affect those hormonal?
It certainly does. So coffee does stimulate the adrenal glands to release cortisol. So it's actively sort of putting another surge of cortisol onto that system. So I think having one in the morning would be in alignment with the circadian rhythm, but then having one in the evening would actually be disrupting it. And so in that respect, I think, everybody is different, so everybody has different sensitivities. But certainly I would recommend sort of limiting it towards the evening for that very reason, that it is disrupting it. We know that it does have other metabolic effects because of that disruption to the circadian rhythm as well, and the production of cortisol. So I'm in the process of actively limiting my coffee intake and just trying to get some back to that balance, and because I've found it to be very disruptive as well.
Does caffeine affect our gut friends?
Caffeine, there hasn't been a lot that I've seen on caffeine effects on the gut microbiome. However, there are a lot of studies on coffee in the gut microbiome, and it's kind of a double-edged sword. The caffeine does create a problem. However, coffee also contains some beneficial polyphenols, and is actually also surprisingly a source of soluble fiber. So we have actually seen some specific gut microbes directly associated with the amount of coffee that people drink. So I will take it or leave it. I usually just do 1 cup in the morning because it will disrupt my circadian rhythms. But yeah, you kind of have a double-edged sword there. Maybe decaf is a way to go.
No. Okay, we're going to continue on with circadian rhythm. The next question here. This has come up quite a bit in the last few years, at least from my paying attention to the media and such, is night shift workers. Obviously, light is a key factor, and I presume fluorescent lighting isn't as useful. So how do people with night shift, how does that affect their circadian rhythm, and what's the consequence of that?
Well, I think in many ways it's like jet lag. So you're forcing your body to go onto a different rhythm from the daylight cycle. So that has the very same effects. So when it's long term, there is evidence that it does increase risk for a number of disorders. And part of that is because of its effects on the body. So even increased weight gain can be associated with shift work. And also increased risk for depression and anxiety are associated with that as well. So it's something that has to be managed very carefully, and switching to a night shift sort of cycle is fine if that then becomes your circadian rhythm. I think the trouble is when there's a lot of shifting around and expecting the body to just switch gears so regularly. It's not the way that it works at its best. And so I think the best way to do it is to try to allow the body time for that rest and repair, and probably maximise as much as you can the other factors, exercise, diet, minimising coffee when you're trying to get to sleep, just so that you can sort of minimise the effects of that circadian shift.
Has there been any work on night shift or disrupted sleep, in which parts of the sleep cycle it affects the most? Bruno?
I'm not sure about that, so I work on Drosophila. So, we can affect their sleep cycles, and typically you see a sleep rebound, right? So whatever sleep got lost needs to be regained. So if you took away deep sleep, then you need more deep sleep. So I think it's more about like which sleep got lost specifically.
Yeah, so the individual body kind of tries to recreate that homeostatic, sort of counting up over days, if you will.
Sleep is a homeostatic process, so the brain knows how much sleep it needs, and it'll figure out a way often to get that balance. And in a way that it'll do that easily without drugs in most people, just if you let it be.
Yeah. Okay, so another question to follow on kind of from that, for you again, Bruno. Do older people benefit from trying to increase the amount of sleep they can get, given you sort of showed that nice age-related change at least up to the age of 16?
Yeah, so old people typically have fragmented sleep. I'm beginning to have that.
I think that's 75, older people, older than 75.
Older than 75.
I think you've got a few years to go.
I omitted that.
Yeah.
So, deep sleep doesn't change that much, the amount of deep sleep. It's really REM sleep that suffers, that gets jettisoned in a way in older people. And there's obviously the worry that that's connected to a loss of creativity, right? And a loss of surprise and just gets habit-driven behavior. So if there was a way of increasing REM sleep to be able to promote that kind of healthier outlook to life and less depression, I think, it could probably be accomplished just as well with meditation, right? So that people are studying this, in Australia and around the world, that, whether REM sleep functions can be accomplished simply by meditation, right? Putting your brain elsewhere, disconnected from the outside world and just ruminating in a way. So I think there's always a concern that you should be getting your 8 hours of sleep. I don't think people should worry about that. If you wake up 6 hours later, that's what your brain needed. Mm-hmm. And maybe it's more about just good, healthy behavior throughout the day as well.
Yeah, so I suppose that sort of semi-conscious state of meditation is the most akin to REM. So when you try to sleep in a bit longer, but you're kind of half awake maybe, you can add a bit to it? Yeah, okay. So here we've got a question about physical exercise. I'll direct this to you, Shuichi. There's been some work saying that physical exercise can help prevent or delay dementia and other degenerative brain disorders. Is that the case, or is it more that maybe some individuals are less prone to exercise because they have these risk factors?
I think life's complex, so I don't think you can say one thing is going to prevent a complex disease like dementia or even depression or schizophrenia. I think you probably find that people who exercise more, that's a proxy of healthy lifestyles they're having anyway, so they're probably more likely to have good diet, probably care about their physical well-being, and these kind of little things and lifestyle habits that you build as you grow up, that's what's probably happening here. And it's just, I think it's just too too difficult to say that exercise can prevent or fix mental illness.
A healthy lifestyle is generally a good thing to have, I suppose.
Yeah, and it's not going to harm you. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, so we've got another one on the gut here. If we have, I'm going to sort of paraphrase this a little, but if we have the perfect amount of fibre, we're doing our best and eating lots of plants, how much does our sugar intake on top of that affect our gut microbiome? Is it irrelevant if you have all the good stuff, or is it competing, or?
Yeah, so in terms of the gut microbiome, sugar isn't going to have that much impact because it's actually absorbed in the small intestine. So it's absorbed by your human cells right away when you ingest that. It's not going to make it down to your gut microbiome. So the problem with high sugar intake is A, it's kind of messing up your human metabolism, and B, usually people that have a high sugar diet aren't getting enough fiber in their diet, and so you're kind of starving your gut microbiome at the same time. If you have a lot of fiber in your diet and you're also eating a lot of sugar, you really just have to worry about how that's affecting your human metabolism, but your gut microbiome should be all right. And honestly, it's kind of something silly that I do, but when I have desserts in the evening, I usually try to make sure there is some fiber with that dessert, so I make sure that I'm also feeding my gut microbes, they're not starving. So, having some fruit with it or something.
Always with the plants, okay. Okay, so I've got a question for you, Sue. Does the cortisol change as we age, and does that affect our circadian rhythm?
So I'm not sure if there's a significant decline or change in it over the lifespan, but for the individual there certainly are changes with the course of their experience of stress. And from that respect, your stress system can become sensitized. So I think if you're releasing a lot of cortisol, if you're having a high stress sort of lifestyle, drinking a lot of coffee, staying up late, doing all these things, that's forcing your body to release stress, even if it's not, if it's just day-to-day stress, where it's pushing itself too hard, the system will adapt and it will actually shut down some of that cortisol release. And so there will be a lower level. And when we look across different studies, that getting the results on levels of cortisol, whether it's in depression, whether it's in different conditions, the data is all over the place. And what we find is that it's because it's so variable between individuals, it's so variable with what's going on in their life at that particular moment. And some of the more reliable things seem to now be taking that very early morning cortisol or the very late sort of evening cortisol to look at it at that high and low ebb of the circadian rhythm, and that's where you can really see some of these differences and some of these sort of changes in the settings of this feedback system that can signal that maybe somebody has been living with stress for too long, and that system has adapted, and there's in a similar way to insulin resistance can occur. There can be a level of cortisol resistance, and so the body works harder to try to produce more and more of that.
I suppose to follow on from that, does that mean if you have sustained stress, early life or late life, will it have a different effect, or is it just kind of the same effect? But
certainly earlier in life, and even in utero, there can be a resetting, an actual sort of hardwiring of this system so that it does become sensitized. And, as Bruno said before, everything makes sense, or more sense in evolution. I'm paraphrasing it, I'm not saying it exactly, as he quoted, but it makes a lot of evolutionary sense that if an individual is being born into a stressful environment, that this system is sensitive and ready to respond. And same with individuals who have experienced a traumatic episode. This system and everything that it's linked with, the inflammatory system, the metabolic system, will register because of changes that have happened in the brain to become more sensitive to particular cues related to that, to a particular stressor, that stress will be released, that whole system will play out much faster and more effectively, which is a very adaptive response of the body in a stressful situation, and then it can be altered and become less adaptive when that individual's in a safe environment, and that's where things like post-traumatic stress disorder can occur.
okay, really interesting. Thank you very much. Thank you to all the speakers. It's about time we wrap up, so we'll finish up the discussion here. So I hope you've all enjoyed today's talks and discussion. I know I have. I think it really demonstrates the multitude of factors that can lead to problems with our mental health. We've got circadian rhythm, and when we time our sleep, we've got our diet and our gut microbiome, exercise and other mental health problems we're dealing with, and our sleep and more generally, in the different aspects of particular parts of our sleep. But it also emphasises there are many ways we can improve our mental well-being as well, using these same strategies to improve these indices, hopefully as a package, as we're starting to hear. Not one thing alone is necessarily the magic silver bullet here. So as you've heard today, there's a lot of research underway looking to understand the brain and mental health. Nevertheless, it is a huge and complex task that requires the concerted efforts of research bodies like the Queensland Brain Institute and other bodies around Brisbane and Australia and the world as well. So having said that, this webinar is quite timely because next week is UQ's Giving Day, and QBI is actually raising funds particularly for mental health research to help all the scientists here do some of this work. And all donations for this fund are going to be matched dollar for dollar by UQ as well. So we can aim to find the best treatments to help people recover from these really debilitating problems we have, and even the smaller mental health issues we all sort of struggle with daily. So we will share the link with you via the email that you registered with, and we thank you for your support in advance. So that wraps it up for today. You'll be able to rewatch the webinar by using the same link that brought you to this today. Thanks again for joining us, and thank you to all the speakers for taking the time to come and speak to the audience here. And we look forward to keeping you all up with our research at QBI. Thank you.